Today, I'm honored to welcome Peter Harris, who is a faculty member at Colorado State University and a fellow at Defense Priorities. Peter, welcome. I would like to kick off our discussion today by asking you a difficult question. I think it's one that's on the minds of a lot of our audience today. Donald Trump campaigned as a peace candidate. He contrasted himself with those who have gotten the United States either directly or indirectly into a lot of wars: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Ukraine most recently. And he promised to end the war in Ukraine and not get into new conflicts. But as he started to put together his new administration and floating both officially and unofficially potential appointments, it appears that many of the names that are being circulated are people who are quite gung-ho about those foreign wars and interventions, who believe that the United States needs to adopt an even more confrontational approach to dealing with both adversaries and partners in the world. So the question that I have for you is, are these names that are being floated symptomatic of this problem that you address in your book? Why America can't retrench? Why there seems to be such difficulty in adopting greater realism and restraint in American foreign policy? Or do you think it's too early to be making judgments about this situation? Peter, what are your thoughts on this?
It's a great question, and obviously a very timely one. I'll just begin, though, by saying thank you for hosting me and for agreeing to do this book talk. I really appreciate the Quincy Institute's efforts, and thank you, George, for hosting. I think the charitable explanation, or the optimistic take maybe for restrainers when it comes to analyzing some of these rumored picks, and I guess we should be careful because some of these have not been confirmed yet, is that Trump may be committed in some way to elements of restraint, and maybe also may be committed to policies of retrenchment in some discrete parts of the world, and that he views these kind of relatively hawkish appointments, like Rubio, Stefanik, Waltz, and others, as a way to intimidate America's adversary, this kind of peace through strength idea, and that he'll use kind of the idea of, oh, look at me, I'm appointing these hawkish advisors around me to intimidate our rivals, and use that as cover to pursue policies of restraint. And this idea that I won't start any wars will actually be true, and Trump's committed to that, and this is part and parcel of that strategy. That's a very charitable explanation of what's going on, though, and I think more likely what is taking place is that Trump knows there are very few political repercussions for breaking promises like this. And this is one of the things I talk about in the book, that our elected leaders quite rightly discern that there are more plaudits to be won in Washington, D.C. from hawkish foreign policies, from sticking to this kind of militarist path and the well-beaten path of primacy, than there are shifting kind of radically towards restraint and retrenchment at this point in time. Now, Trump probably knew, again, rightly, that there were votes to be won, some votes to be won by appealing to kind of segments of the electorate that are war-weary, that are tired of militarism, that would like to see resources shifted to the domestic side, and he kind of appealed to those voters on the campaign trail, both in 2016 and then again this year. But then he knows that he can walk back on those promises, and the political incentives shift once you're in office to bring in the party together, to avoiding fissures within the party, appointing people from various wings of the Republican Party, keeping people on side, keeping people happy. And he probably won't face political repercussions for breaking promises like this. And that's a problem. He should. Right? You should face political repercussions for pursuing the war policy. You should face repercussions for failing to follow through on promises to pursue restraint and retrenchment. We're not there yet, and we need to reform our political system so that we get there. The last thing I'd say is we're probably not quite there yet, as kind of many of us on the call will be kind of pro-restraint and a slimmed down American foreign policy. We're not really there yet in terms of the personnel being available to fill all of these spots. In a much better place than we were, say, 10 years ago. And there are options for Trump when it comes to Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor. So I think we have a right to be disappointed if he overlooks those options and goes with some of the more kind of traditional hawkish appointees in the Republican Party. But we're really not there yet in going from beyond providing an option to creating a set of incentives that make those options really appealing and that he can't look past them. If you think about if this is an oppositional thing between the restrainers and the primacists, it would just seem to be that the primacists have done a better job over a long period of time organizing American politics to incentivize the appointment of their people. And we're not there yet, right? The incentives just don't exist for the executive branch to be staffed and stuffed full of restrainers. And it just tells me there's a lot of work to be done. I think restraint can be popular. I think restraint can be sold to the American people. I think it's the best grand strategy from the perspective of U.S. national interests. But there's a mismatch with the political incentives that our leaders face once they're in office. And that's where the work now is, to bring those things into alignment.
Well, I'd like to return to that question of this incentive structure, the rewards that you get for being a hawk, and the lack of rewards, as you're describing them, for people that are pursuing a slimmed down, more restrained, more realistic approach to the world. But before we get to that, I want to take a little bit of a backup here and ask you about retrenchment. This is the major theme of your book. Why can't America retrench? So how did we get to the position that we're in right now? It didn't happen overnight. There's not a long tradition of American primacy, looking at the history of American foreign policy. It's a relatively recent phenomenon, certainly something in the last couple of generations, perhaps. Where did we start and how did we wind up in the situation that we're in right now? How did America become so overextended in the world?
In my book, I pinpoint the early Cold War, the World War II, and then early Cold War eras as the moment that this changed. So I think you're right. For the first two-thirds of America's history as an independent republic, the government wouldn't shy away from military confrontation with America's rivals, but it would mobilize the military to fight wars, and then it would demobilize in line with long-standing Republican traditions, such as small government, skepticism of a large standing military, and fiscal prudence. Right? The idea was when a national security exigency emerges, we should fight the war, defeat our adversaries, but then bring the military back down into proper proportions. That happened after the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, War of 1898, and then again in World War I. But it didn't happen after World War II. The history that I am familiar with shows that President Truman wanted to, demobilize the military after World War II, and in fact was implementing the fastest demobilization in history for certain months during 1945. But the onset of the Cold War kind of put a stop to that. And the idea was that the Soviet Union could not be allowed, and listeners will be familiar with this history, but could not be allowed to dominate Western Europe and East Asia because that would jeopardize U.S. National interests and economic security for sure, but eventually, ultimately, our national security too. So reluctantly, and it was very reluctant at first, the United States government, the executive branch and the Congress agreed that the United States would remain forward deployed. And if you look at those kind of Senate hearings where the administration is explaining to the Senate why permanent forward deployments are necessary and why treaty commitments with our allies are necessary, they're justified as being temporary. Right? Once our allies are back on their feet, the United States will do what we've always done in the past and bring the national military establishment back down to reasonable proportions, and that never happened. Over the course of the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s, something took place that international relations scholars refer to as second image reversed. It just means international exigencies, international forces, and international needs acted upon the US state and redesigned it. Our federal government was changed, our economy was changed, our political culture was changed, facets of the American heartland were just rewired such that all these traditional things about American political culture and society and politics were kind of forgotten. And we learned to love the military and learn to take pride in the military and learn to identify ourselves as a country, the leader of the free world, in a way that would have been alien to people, in prior eras. So America changed, right? And the original title for this book was Hardwired: Why America Can't Retrench. And I think that's what took place is the US political system became hardwired. It was built for a purpose, and the purpose was to police the world militarily, the global military primacy. So even when the Cold War ended in 1989, 1991, we were left with a state that was built to do a particular thing, and that thing was project military power abroad. So I agree with you that for the first, most of America's existence as an independent republic, about 2/3 of its existence, the country it didn't know anything like this. But for the last third, we haven't known anything different. And you have to be pretty old American in your late 80s, really, to remember a time when US military forces were not forward deployed in defense of our allies. Everyone born from the 1940s onwards, this is all we've known, and it's all our leaders have known, and we live in a state that was built to do this. I think that's when it happened. That it was the experience of the Cold War really induced our leadership to build a state for the purpose of implementing military primacy, and to move past that, we need a new state. We have to change again.
So, Peter, President Eisenhower warned of what he called the military-industrial complex. How does that concept, as it's become popularly known, differ with the argument that you're making here? Are they basically different terms for the same thing, or are you describing something that's a little bit different?
It's a little different. So Eisenhower, you're right. Right at the beginning of the Cold War, there were skeptics of this over militarization of the U.S. Economy and the U.S. state, and Eisenhower was one of them, like a war hero. But ultimately, those warnings are right in the book. They kind of fell on deaf ears, or they just didn't win the day. Eisenhower was talking about the relationship between legislators, executive branch officials, especially in the DoD, and economic interest, this kind of iron triangle between those three interest groups. And he was worried about fiscal resources being kind of pilfered from the public purse and devoted towards armaments in a way that kind of outstripped what was really necessary for national security. That's part of what I talk about in the book. It's a big part of it. Other scholars like Michael Brennan and others have done kind of better work than me on documenting the economic side of this and the military industrial complex as it was described by Eisenhower. I say it's just part of it though, because I think there are other institutions of state and other organs of the federal government that also need to be reformed, that they share just as much of the blame as this political economy aspect. I think the two political parties that we have, the duopoly of the Republicans and the Democrats, is a problem. I think the aggrandizement of the presidency an executive branch at the expense of Congress is a problem. I think the size of Congress is a problem. I think our political culture, has changed in a way that even if you were to weaken the political power of the arms industry, Americans' political culture has changed, and the way we think about the country and its role in the world needs to be revisited, and some kind of national renewal needs to take place. So I think that the political economy side of this is a huge part of it, right? It creates all these incentives for legislators to keep voting for high defense budgets, but it's only one part of it. And there are other elements of the US political system broadly understood, the media, the think tank kind of industry, all this kind of stuff. It's all a big kind of milieu that needs to be analyzed when we understand why America can't restrain. It's really across the whole span of the political system.
So quite a formidable problem. And I think I want to talk about, before we get into what do we do about this problem, I want to talk a little bit about what you mean by retrenchment. When you use that term, you're using it with a particular definition in mind. Oftentimes that gets shorthanded by critics as isolationism. How would you contrast those two terms? What do you mean by retrenchment? And do you think that differs from isolationism?
It does differ, yeah. And in the book, I talk about retrenchment, but without retreat. So I kind of define retrenchment as the downsizing or the pulling back of military commitments. So it's about reducing America's military footprint overseas and its commitments overseas. And then as a consequence of that, the United States will earn for itself the ability to shrink the military footprint here at home, which I think also needs to be done. But this is about ending wars, ending forward deployments, shifting the burden of defense onto US allies, if not kind of terminating those alliances and at least shifting the burden of defense more onto allies. It's specifically in the military realm. I have a chapter in the book called Internationalism Anew, where I try to make clear my argument that the United States should not and must not retreat from the world in diplomatic affairs and economic affairs. When it comes to humanitarian aid and economic assistance, America can and should, and I think must remain a leader in those spheres, but it does not need to be underpinned by forward deployed military forces. And retrenchment really is a prerequisite for renewing America's domestic society, but also putting in place a foreign policy that makes more sense from the perspective of US national interests, and I think also for the well-being of the whole world. So retrenchment really does not mean isolationism, and I do not regard myself as an isolationist. I would like to see a more outward-looking, open, confident United States on the world stage. I'm a new American, a naturalized citizen, so I'm optimistic about America. I love America, and I don't mind saying that. I think America has got a lot to contribute to the world and how it's organized, and I think America can do a lot to improve the lives of people in other countries, but not through the application of military force. That needs to be done as a last resort to defend core national interests, national defense strictly defined. And I would prefer to see a reformed foreign policy along those lines that would be internationalist, but in a very different non-military way.
So you've mentioned that this slimmed down approach to the world is a necessary part of renewing America domestically. Can you talk a little bit about the connection between foreign policy and domestic renewal and strength at home?
Sure. I mean, some of these statistics shocked me when I was researching the book. The Congressional Budget Office says that the federal government employs about 2.25 million service personnel, if you include the reserves and kind of everyone in uniform, about 2.25 million people. and it also employs about 2.25 million civilians. So the federal government is split about 50-50 between service personnel and civilians. But of those civilians, about 60% of those work in the DoD, Department for Veterans Affairs, and Department of Homeland Security. So only 40% of one half of the federal government's manpower is devoted towards uh, domestic programs. So about 20% of federal employees. It's not like that in other countries, right? I'm originally from the UK. The biggest employer in the UK is the National Health Service. And then we have all teachers are employment of the central government. Universities are controlled by the central government. Most governments around the world deliver services to the people. The government in the United States, the federal government, of course, the states do a lot of other stuff, but the federal government is really not in the business of delivering services to the American people. It writes checks. So the biggest items in the federal budget, as you know, are entitlement programs. It writes checks, but administering those takes very little manpower. What the federal government employs people to do is fight wars, take care of people who fought wars, and to prepare to fight more wars. There are huge opportunity costs that come with that, right? With a defense budget that's approaching $1 trillion a year, interest payments on the debt that by some estimates are going to exceed that amount of money that's being spent on defense. And then, like, as I say, about 80% of federal manpower devoted towards security. The opportunity costs are just enormous. The American people, I think, could flourish a lot better, whether that's in the form of tax cuts, reducing the size of the deficit and the interest payments on the deficit, or delivering more and better services to people to improve the quality of life. The opportunity cost that we pay by having this unusually large, both in historical terms on what we used to be as a country, and in comparative terms to other countries, we're kind of wasting money and we're wasting manpower, we're wasting resources by looking outwardly in a military way instead of looking domestically and spending money in ways that would improve the lives and livelihoods of ordinary Americans. So that's why I think there's a huge connection between foreign policy and domestic renewal. You'll never really have a federal government that can invest in domestic renewal. However, we could disagree over how that should be done, but that will really invest in domestic renewal so long as it is so overwhelmingly focused on pursuing military primacy.
All right. We are getting questions in from the audience. For those of you interested in posing questions, you can use the Q&A function on your Zoom panel. This one I think is particularly pertinent to this question of history in the United States and elsewhere in the world. The question is, has there ever been an empire, and the US is an empire, that retrenched deliberately? The British Empire couldn't keep its colonies, the Roman Empire more or less the same. Do you think the American Empire will ever retrench unless it is forced to? What's your response on that, Peter?
That's a great question. I'd take the last part of the question first. So, people on the call might be familiar with Patrick Porter's work on the kind of the blob and the foreign policy blob, and he has this pessimistic conclusion. I think it's somewhat pessimistic that some kind of exogenous shock or crisis, right, is going to be necessary to convince America's elite to pursue retrenchment. So that very well may be true, right? And we may be like other empires past or great powers past that essentially had to be forced to retrench, perhaps. We shouldn't give in to that though, right? I mean, that we shouldn't be content with that. I think this is a democratic republic, and as citizens, we get a say in what our foreign policy is. And I'd say what maybe makes us different from past empires is that we are a democratic republic with a vibrant civil society, with people who've got a voice and that can tell our elected officials that we want something different. So I'm hard pressed on the spot to think of an empire that retrenched kind of willingly out of self-interest and therefore, kind of made it. I'd have to go back to my Jack Snyder Myths of Empire book to see if there were any great examples of that. But I would just say that I don't think the United States should condemn itself to following that trajectory. We should instead insist that as citizens we've got agency and that we don't want to live in an empire. We want to live in a democratic republic and that we can retrench. One last thing I'd say is there are some instances in the book that I discuss that give kind of glimmers of how retrenchment in the US context have worked. The United States has retrenched in the past, right? We can end wars. We do end. It's just unpopular when it happens. So what we need to do is find a way to reform or reconfigure domestic politics so that we do what we have done in the past in terms of ending wars and reducing our commitments, but it becomes the popular thing to do, and that leaders are in fact attracted to those ideas rather than having them forced upon them.
Well, this brings us back to a point you made earlier in this discussion about the reward structure, the incentive structure that presidents and administrations have being not geared toward encouraging retrenchment and restraint in the world, just the opposite. Hardline, hawkish policies are applauded and rewarded, and retrenchment, realism, more modest and pragmatic approaches tend to be punished. Now, this, I think, raises some quite fundamental questions. You said, the United States is a democracy. Unlike some of these other empires historically, the United States people should have some kind of an impact, potentially a restraining effect on government actions, on our willingness to go to war in situations where we're not actually attacked as a nation. And that, of course, is one of the premises of Immanuel Kant's democratic peace theory, that in democracies, the people play a restraining role. What's gone wrong with this mechanism? Why are the American people not being as effective as one might hope in exercising that restraint function?
I think we have broken institutions, and it starts with the political parties. There's the two parties in this country. They're established. They're kind of quasi governmental organizations. The hardwired to the state in the sense that states they run political parties' elections for them. They control who can get on the ballot. There's a great book by Lisa Dish from a few years ago now called The Tyranny of the Two-Party System that shows how the parties and the state governments kind of collude to keep out third parties. And the Democrats and the Republicans both have been somewhat captured by kind of hawkish militarist interests, which made a lot of electoral sense for them in the Cold War and afterwards, but doesn't make much sense today. I think if we had, and this is one of the more radical proposals I advance in the book, at least radical for a US context, a proportional representation, a multi-party system, more political pluralism, where people's votes really mattered and they could choose to assign their vote to candidates and parties that really truly aligned with them on foreign policy and other issues, we would see this conveyor belt between what the people want and what the government does restored. Right now, it's a broken conveyor belt. What the people want and what the government does, it just doesn't transmit in that way. And I really blame the two-party system for that. I think is a big problem. And Ben Friedman at Defense Priorities has written about this, and I draw on some of his work. But if you had a more multi-party system, I think you would get on the left and on the right and in the center, I think you would get political parties emerging out of political self-interest, representing the American people's pretty real view that militarism has gone too far and that primacy needs to end and that resources should be devoted to the home front. But we don't get that. And I really big critic of the two-party system, and I pin a lot of the blame on the way that is set up currently.
Another question that I think is reflective of a lot of people's concerns, fears that if the United States does in fact retrench,
Mhm.
that this will create a vacuum of power in the world that our adversaries will seek to fill. And the United States will not be more secure, we will be actually more endangered. What's your reaction to that concern?
I think the restrainers will never win unless they have a credible answer to that question, because the American people are never going to vote for candidates and for policies that they suspect will leave them worse off in security terms. So it's a great question, and we need to have robust answers to it. My response would be that this internationalism anew that I'm talking about, so not primacy, but internationalism anew, absolutely needs to have at its core a strong national defense. The United States needs to invest in a navy and an air force and nuclear weapons sufficient to deter adversaries from attacking the US homeland. And that's non-negotiable. Retrenchment and restraint cannot be pursued without this commitment to a very strong, robust national defense. But I think my response to the kind of what's implied in the question is overseas deployments and the pursuit of primacy really makes us less safe, right? And the retrenchment would certainly make us more safe in the sense that we have somewhere between 170,000 and 200,000 American servicemen and women deployed abroad at any given time, and they're deployed adjacent to war zones, right? I mean, by design, right? They're kind of in vulnerable allied nations that need, or they needed in the past, U.S. military deployments to keep them safe. So, of course, if you deploy troops to Iraq, if you deploy troops to northern Syria, if you deploy troops to the Asia Pacific, there's a high risk that they get attacked. And in the Middle East, this happens, right? Sadly, tragically, American service personnel, they come home in coffins. I mean, did they lose their lives as a result of this implementation of military primacy? And I don't think that keeps the American people safe. I'm very worried about the way things are trending with Taiwan, and I'm very worried with the suggestion that the way to keep the peace in Taiwan is to surge American forces into the Asia Pacific. Those forces are at risk, right? And it is a huge risk of the United States being brought into a war or fighting a war that is really nothing to do with U.S. national security. So absolutely, any replacement, um, any foreign policy to replace this grand strategy of primacy needs to have a robust, uncompromising focus on U.S. national security. But we shouldn't shy away from making the case that the current setup, the current foreign policy of primacy, it leaves us really vulnerable to attack from our adversaries. And I think restraint would remove some of that vulnerability.
I want to talk a little bit about the media. We've got several questions in about their role in all of this. Um, every day in the world, bad things happen. And there can be a lot of pressure, a lot of it generated by the media to do something about these problems. And there's a belief that because of its vast power, because of American values, America actually has a moral obligation to do something about these bad developments. How should America's leaders address these pressures of what you might call do somethingism that are oftentimes driven by media campaigns?
My argument in the book is that restrainers need to be pretty aggressive on this front, and it's about making new media. I think one of the advantages that we have today, as opposed to say 10, 15 years ago, is that the media landscape is fragmenting. You know, cable news and print media is losing some of its impact and is kind of siloed, kind of online media, podcasts and whatnot are becoming much more important in terms of where people get their news. And I think the restraint community has got a real opportunity to fill a lot of the media landscape with restraint friendly narratives. I don't think you're going to change CNN or the New York Times or the Washington Post overnight at least, but you can create alternative media sources that I think Americans in the marketplace of ideas would be interested in listening to. So the Trump people, I think the America First kind of group around Trump have actually done a pretty good job at this. They have news channels and they have kind of internet streaming services, and I'm not really familiar with all of this, but podcasts and websites and all this kind of stuff that changes the media landscape, has biased it somewhat. So there's media content out there for the America First American. Um, I just don't think they're very committed to retrenchment and restraint is the problem. But so those who are genuinely committed to restraint and retrenchment, I think they need to look at creating options. We can't sit back and cede the media landscape to people who, as you say, trot out these tired tropes about the indispensable nation. We need to get out there and put out an alternative view that I think, Americans would buy. And the the overarching theme of a lot of this, just to kind of step back for a moment, is, my response or my kind of call for domestic reform. It's not about putting in place like a rigged system that would favor restraint-based narratives. It's about pluralism, pluralism in politics, pluralism in the media. I think pluralism, it will trend towards restraint and retrenchment because that's what America, a large part of America wants, and those voices have just been silenced and sidelined. Bringing those into the media landscape, into the political process, I think will trend towards retrenchment. I have confidence in that.
So when you talk about pluralism, obviously you're talking about pluralism at home in the United States. So there's less of a monolithic set of prescriptions for the world. What about internationally? Does that also apply to pluralism in the world?
I think the US has to tolerate the existence of ideas and ideologies and probably regime types that we dislike. Yes. I think that is a prudent thing to do in a world where we're not, if we ever were, we're certainly no longer omnipotent and should not be omnipresent either. Some level of toleration is necessary. And I think that somewhere in the book I call this some like the torment of restraint or the anguish of restraint, that it's very difficult, right, to live in a world where atrocities are taking place, where 1.3 billion Chinese people live under a communist dictatorship, where people in Iran, where women can be beaten to death, right, for not covering their hair. It's difficult to live in a world where those kind of abuses and atrocities that take place and things that offend us. And there's a torment to that. Like the restraint person, right? The restraint mindset it involves this certain degree of being able to live with um, things that really offend us and distress us. I don't have a way around that. I mean, in the final chapter of the book, Internationalism Anew, I give some ideas for how the United States can pursue a values-based, ethical foreign policy aimed at promoting U.S. values around the world. But the militarist solution is the wrong one and has been shown time and again not to work. And we kind of I think you're right. We probably do have to live in a world where we tolerate the intolerable. I mean, it's a very difficult kind of space to live in, but that is where we need to end up.
Well, let's explore that a little bit more. You're talking about the second part of your book title, not so much why America can't retrench, but how it might.
Mhm.
What kind of solutions? You started to get into that. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what ought to be done?
Yes, and I'll begin by saying, though, I don't think I'm pretty confident. I know that those in the restraint community will not agree on this. But what I would love a takeaway from the book to be is whatever your domestic political views and persuasion, I'd love to conversation to be started on what some form of domestic reforms will look like. When people want to change America in the past, they don't just advocate for policy change, they advocate for political change too. And I use the progressive movement in the past as an example here. The progressives remade America for better and for worse, but they didn't just advocate for bills in Congress. I mean, they changed the way America chooses senators, right? They altered the Constitution. They changed the primary process and how political parties were selecting nominees. You need institutional change to match these policy changes. It's going to take a while, I think, for different camps of restrainers on the left and on the right and in the center to agree on what these domestic reforms might look like. But I really want to make the point that some form of reform needs to happen and we need to have that conversation. My ideas include things like disestablishing the two political parties. I would love to see it where state governments are not involved in running primaries for the two political parties. They should become private members organizations that control their own membership rolls, that run their own internal elections, that raise their own funds and spend their own funds however they want as private organizations. The state should get out of the business of being involved in the party system. Make it easier for third, fourth, fifth parties to emerge. We have a more pluralistic landscape. I would love to see proportional representation introduced for federal elections, and state level elections too. I want to see an enlarged Congress. I think the House of Representatives is too small. I think the Senate is too small. More representatives, more representation, and more pluralism, I think will trend towards better foreign policy. I can't go into detail in all of these, but I think there needs to be legislative changes to how Congress and the presidency interact. We have the War Powers Resolution, which no president has ever regarded as constitutional. I think we need some kind of Peace Powers Resolution. And if that is going to involve a constitutional amendment, then ideally that would happen too. Right now, the president can, as commander-in-chief, can move military forces around the world at will, including in or adjacent to war zones. They can't declare war, but if you put tens of thousands of American service personnel next to a war, it's tantamount to the same thing. So Congress probably needs to have more of a role in restraining the presidency. Of course, you need legislators, you need people in Congress with an interest in exercising those powers, and we haven't had that for a long time. Congress has abdicated its responsibility, but we need to kind of look at reforms there. A better resourced Congress. Right now, there's an information asymmetry between the presidency and the Congress, where the people in the executive branch got access to much more and better information about the world than members of Congress. They need more advisors, policy advisors, when it comes to foreign policy. And then the last one I'll talk about is ultimately we need to freeze at least or cut defense spending and shift some of those federal resources, dollars, but also personnel to domestic programs. Americans need to see a tangible peace dividend where reductions in military effort, the stopping of wars, is very visibly translated and shifted towards material benefits to them. Whether that's checks going to people's homes in the forms of a rebate, whether that's better public services, or a tax cut, whatever it would look like, Americans need to see that kind of shift from the military side of things to the civilian side in really tangible, obvious terms. That's how you get buy-in, I think.
A question in about the draft, military conscription. There are those that argue that the end of conscription in the United States actually facilitated more foreign interventionism, a willingness to use the military because it didn't affect the lives, the freedom of a lot of the country's wealthier, most educated citizenry. And the thought is that restoring conscription would once again restore that link between decisions to intervene abroad and the day-to-day lives and security of the people that have to do the fighting in those wars. What's your thought on this? Is addressing this question of conscription part of the solution that we ought to be thinking about, or is that not going to be productive?
My personal view is that conscription is not the right approach. Not in favor of the draft or conscription. From a personal political point of view, I'm not in favor of people being forced to join the military. So for me, that's not something that I would necessarily support as a starting point. But I think the questioner is absolutely right in terms of the logic of the costs of militarism need to be socialized in some way. And it's certainly a domestic reform that I would consider and I would want to be part of this conversation, right? If you were to get kind of left of center progressive restrainers and right of center conservative constrainers and libertarian constrainers in a room to hash out what some kind of renewed domestic compact might look like, um, that should be part of the conversation, right? That should be something that we discuss. And I can see the logic of how socializing the costs of militarism should lead, therefore, to less militarism. Personally, I would probably have a problem with it from a civil liberties point of view. That my argument would be to kind of, I would push back a little on it, but I can certainly see the logic, and things like that need to be part of the conversation.
Um, Question about what the United States needs to do to enable a different approach to the world, one that's less interventionist, less militaristic. We obviously, as you pointed out, have evolved a system that is quite good at planning for foreign wars, quite good at intervening in various ways through the military and paramilitary special operations, that sort of thing. Um, but we have put comparatively little effort, I would say, in developing and cultivating our diplomatic expertise, which I would say is a necessary component of ensuring American national security in the world. Um, is the United States right now capable, through its diplomatic service, of uh, approaching the world in the manner that you're advocating? Um, is there work that has to be done here to beef up America's diplomatic muscle, so to speak?
I think America is capable of almost anything. It's a great nation. It's a large nation. It's a wealthy nation. I think it's got the best universities in the world. It's got the best diplomatic corps in the world. I think it's capable of anything. I think it's right now its diplomatic corps is hamstrung by the fact that this militarist side of our foreign policy undermines us at every turn. And when I speak to people, I have colleagues in Mauritius, I have colleagues that I speak to in other parts of the world. They're skeptical of US leadership and soft power because this hard power element that we exercise, it undermines us at every turn. So I really believe that cutting the size of the military establishment, cutting the cost of militarism, retrenching from active war zones, reducing the likelihood that we'll be kind of dragged into unwanted wars in the future, will unleash and embolden and empower our current diplomats. I'd love to see an enlarged diplomatic corps too, to do great work. The one thing I talk about in the book, and Jessica Chen Weiss and others have talks about this in more detail than I have, but America's soft power is still enormous. By which I mean it's attractiveness. Right? People around the world, everywhere around the world, there are people who want to be like the United States. They want to come to the United States like I did. People swim across oceans to get to the United States. No one does that unless you kind of a criminal in some regard. You're not really doing that to get to Russia, right, or to China. Our soft power is absolutely enormous. It's just undermined and complicated by the unsound ways that we apply our hard power. And I think if American diplomats were untethered from this albatross of these permanent wars, these forever wars, and were allowed to advance a positive, optimistic case for American values and for the United States, they would do great things. And the rest of the world, not, of course, there are authoritarian governments around the world that have that are very much opposed to us. But ordinary people around the world, from Hong Kong to St. Petersburg to Tehran and elsewhere, they like America and they like what we have to offer. And a diplomatic corps should be allowed to tap into that potential and not held back by this really deeply unpopular militarist component of our foreign policy.
So the argument that you just made is oftentimes cited by uh, interventionists as justification for trying to transform other countries. A lot of people do want to live in the United States. A lot of people wish that their countries were more like the United States, where they would have the freedom to rebuild their lives, to start anew, to make themselves what they believe they potentially could be. And the interventionists say yes, and that's why we need to transform these other countries to make them more like the United States. How do you respond to that argument?
It doesn't work except in extreme cases like the occupation of West Germany and Japan after World War II. It really doesn't work. It would be my first response. And then the second response would be, my book is really rooted in the idea that the purpose of US foreign policy is to advance the interests of the American people first and foremost. I think there's this idea of what Tocqueville called self-interest properly understood. He said Americans had this idea of self-interest properly understood, which is that we flourish best when other people are flourishing too. So I think there is an argument for promoting American values abroad that can be rooted in self-interest. But to do that from the barrel of a gun, to do that militarily, has been proven time and time again to undermine the national security of the United States, and that's not okay. I'm not okay with a foreign policy that's rooted in anything other than promoting the interests of the American people. And I think military restraint, military retrenchment, absolutely will make American people safer, more secure, more prosperous. You can still have a commitment to self-interest properly understood by wanting the rest of the world to flourish as we do in America. But as soon as that becomes a militaristic endeavor and a militarized endeavor, not only do you make things worse for people overseas, but you jeopardize the national security of the American people, and that's not okay. That's not a solvent grand strategy, and that's not one that I would support. So I would, push back against the interventionist there and say, look, I agree the rest of the world would be better off if it was democratic under Republican forms of government. The way to pursue that is not militarily. That will only lead to the kind of ruin that we've seen of the past 20, 30 years of American foreign policy. It's not a great track record.
Mhm. Um, One of the fears that I think arise when you talk about cutting military spending is that this will actually have quite a disruptive effect on an American economy that has become so intertwined with military spending, with this large government sector that you've referred to earlier, and that surgery on this part of our economy will in fact kill the patient. So why take the risk? What is it that compels us to slim down our defense sector, cut back on defense spending, when we may end up doing more harm than good, violating the Hippocratic Oath, so to speak, in policy terms?
It has to be handled with real care and foresight. So I think cutting off communities from around the United States from defense spending overnight, it would be disastrous in the short term. It would be very disruptive. It would be an economic catastrophe for a lot of communities. That's true. But the opportunity costs that we pay right now by spending close to $1 trillion on defense every single year are real. And I would like people to consider that, not all of that trillion, but hundreds of millions of dollars could be better spent domestically in a way that would make even those people who benefit from Pentagon largesse better off. The amount of for every dollar you put into the arms and aerospace industry, jobs are created, right? But you also create jobs if you pay people to dig holes and fill them up again. You can take that money and invest it in more productive industries. You can take that money and get and unleash investment in the form of tax cuts. The amount of money we lose as a nation servicing the national debt is really crippling in terms of our economic growth. There are ways that you can pursue what we call like a just transition to aid and assist communities to move away from this the reliance on defense spending and pivot towards industries that would be create better jobs, create more economic growth, and better funded public services. So instantly disruptively cutting off defense spending? No, absolutely not. But slowly, in a gradual, far-sighted, intentional way, transition America towards industries that are better for the economy. Yes, and I think the opportunity costs we pay right now are too high, and America really would be more prosperous, more secure, and more democratic if we reform our foreign policy in tandem with some set of domestic reforms.
Um, we're coming very close to the end of our hour here, but I want to ask one more question inspired by your last answer. I think there's a growing consensus in the United States that our allies need to pull more of their weight, share more of the burden for achieving healthy balances of power in the world. Obviously, Donald Trump has, for many years, campaigned on the premise that our NATO allies are not pulling their share. They need to do a lot more. The question then becomes, how do you manage that sort of transition toward a more capable Europe, shouldering more responsibility for security in Europe and in the world? Do you do it abruptly? Do you basically say, gravy train is over, Europe, you're going to have to adjust, fend for yourselves more? Or do you approach this in, as you put it earlier, more of a gradualist, managed way that allows a transition? There are arguments for both of those particular approaches. Where do you come down on that?
I try and have my cake and eat it too, which members of the audience can they can let me know if this is reasonable or not. But I think the announcement needs to be abrupt. It needs to be clear, it needs to be uncompromising, and it needs to set a deadline that the United States is now viewing itself as, we're gonna retrench, and this needs to be made known privately at first, but ultimately publicly to tie the hands of U.S. leaders to follow through on this. But they will need allies would need some period of time, years, to rearm sufficiently to defend themselves. But there needs to be some kind of end date at which these tripwire forces, these forward deployments, they're coming home. And you've got a period of time in which to rearm and make sure that once they do come home, that you're well equipped for national self-defense. The good thing is, I think, at least in Europe, the realization is beginning to dawn on people that we cannot be allied with the Democratic Party alone, right? And we cannot be allied with kind of 40,000, 60,000 voters spread across Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. We need to be allied with the United States or not at all. If we're dependent upon such a slither of the US public, this is not sustainable. So I think that the conditions, we're moving towards a period of time where the conditions might be ripe for the United States to make that announcement that this is what we would like to undergo a period of retrenchment for our own national self-interest, and to advance your national self-interest, you must now undergo a period of rearmament.
Very good. Well, we have reached the end of our hour. Peter, thank you very much. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. I think we're only beginning to skim the surface of this very important issue, but I would urge our audience to read Peter's book, Why America Can't Retrench and How It Might. I think it's a real contribution to our national discussion on a very important topic that's going to be with us for a long time to come, I think. And thank all of you who participated today. I want to mention that the Quincy Institute's next webinar is going to be tomorrow at noon. It is also a book talk with Sheila Fitzpatrick, hosted by my colleague Anatole Levin. And you can register for that event by going to our events page, quincyinst.org, for our events. You can also subscribe to the Quincy mailing list from our homepage, quincyinst.org, and you'll receive invitations to all our events and be able to follow our work. So thanks again to all of you for participating, and we will look forward to our next online event tomorrow.